That concludes our first panel, and we'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you would, please come down to the mic so we can hear you and get it on tape. Any questions, comments?
I represent the library, right? And IEEE mentioned that we should get. Why are you so expensive to get? And why do you impose so many licensing restrictions to the libraries? We want them to have access to the standards, right?
Yeah, who would like to field that?
None.
Yeah, why are the standards so expensive? Why aren't there licensing agreements for the schools and colleges and so forth?
I can offer one thing, Daniela, on behalf of ANSI, and I don't speak for ANSI, but I'm aware that they have this resource, which is a website where many SDOs, my own SDO included, have posted read-only access to standards. So to the extent it's useful to be online and look at them, you know, the students can do that.
Yes.
I don't know about the printing and, you know, the copying, but online access is out there. I think a lot of SDOs are doing that now, just as an extra way to put standards out there without necessarily cutting into the important revenue stream that it provides to all the nonprofit SDOs, which we all are.
Yes.
I can probably comment a little bit on that as well. And that's, in the IEEE, there's a whole series of 802 standards for communications. And the policy is after 6 months after they're published, they're available for free.
Okay.
So that's a start.
That's a start.
There is a cost associated with developing all of these standards. And unfortunately today, there's a big legal cost associated with standards because we live in a litigious society and everybody sues. Right? So it all adds up to the cost, which makes for a challenge in trying to keep the standards as affordable as possible. But we're very, as SDOs, we're all very cognizant of the cost of our standards.
Thank you.
Oh, I have one thing to add.
Okay.
So for our committees, if you're a member after the document is published, the committee members do get free copies. So let's say you're a student, you're a member. Now you can't distribute to other people, but you could have your own private copy.
Okay.
I'll just add one more comment. I mentioned this during my presentation, and that's IEEE Explore. If the university subscribes to that, students at the university can get copies of all of the standards at no cost.
Yes. They pay tuition.
Right. Thanks. Another question?
Can you hear me? Sorry. Okay. When a new technology or like a new material is developed in lab in either industry or in a university, how do you create the standards? Do you wait for that new material to be used in the industry, or do you wait for some sort of patenting license to happen? Like, how does that all work?
Greg, you want to comment?
That's a great question. A lot of times technology and innovation, will lead in the development of one new material, one new product. If you look at a lot of the things that we as organizations write standards about or certify, it's a model or a product line. You heard toasters, you heard barbecue grills, things along those lines. There's multiple manufacturers that are making those products. So when you have a new and emerging or evolving technology or a product per se, you can develop a technical standard, or we call them requirements. I can't remember what you all's term for it is, but the organizations that do conformity assessment can work with a manufacturer of that product to develop a methodology to evaluate the safety features of that product. Then once that product gets commercialized and it starts to go through that process, more competition is going to enter into the stream. You're going to have other people making it, other people using it, and it'll evolve to a point where then you have multiple folks engaged. You can develop a standard around that product line.
There's another issue when it comes to a new product, and that's the world of patents. If I'm a company and I have a new product and I have it really tied up in patents, and I want one of the SDOs to develop a standard, they're going to say, wait a minute, you've got that patented. Are there other people interested in using that product or in manufacturing that product, you as a patent holder have got to declare what patents you have and agree that you will provide reasonable access to other companies to those patents. Otherwise, you can't build a standard around a patented product.
I'd like to, if I may, add one more thing to that. A lot of the product standards are performance-based, and that means you can build it out of anything you want, provided it passes performance tests like flammability or impact testing or its ability to withstand a load at elevated temperatures. So it's not necessarily as much material-based as performance-based many times.
Okay, Jeff?
Just from an ASTM perspective, a lot of what's been said we agree with as well. Like, you don't bring patents into a standard. If you're going to bring your thing to ASTM to write a standard about whatever it is, ASTM is going to get the copyright for that standard and everything that's published about that, so if there's data and everything else associated with that. And the reason we do that is ASTM has to be impartial, and we won't write a standard around your particular piece of equipment. Some other folks may do something like that, but from an ASTM perspective, we're going to write, like I mentioned, the crayon standard. You might have the best crayon in the world, you know. You might not be having the one that has asbestos in it now that they're complaining about. So you're going to bring that. But that standard is going to address all crayons. It's not going to address just yours. Oh, okay? So it's important for the standards to be, you know, they got to be very particular, very technical, and very precise, but they can't be biased towards one product over another.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
My question is, if somebody wants to put the Underwriters sticker or some other standard sticker on their product, are they responsible for completing some testing that certifies that their product or whatever it is up to the standard? Or is that something that the organizations that you guys represent are responsible for? And then what happens if that product is then to fail, like against what that standard promises or certifies?
That one. Yes, a manufacturer of a product will submit his product to Underwriters Laboratories or CSA for that matter, and we will use the published standard in effect and test it to that standard. And if it conforms with the standard, boom, you get to put the label on it. If it does not, we'll tell you where it fell short, and you're at liberty to improve it and resubmit and try again. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Good.
Anybody else? Jeff?
Well, ASTM, we don't have certification programs. We started getting into that recently, but we don't. What we have is something that somebody self-declares. Like if you're going to wear, if you go to a bicycle, buy a bicycle helmet, and it's going to say conforms with ASTM D something, I'm not sure, or F something, I'm not sure what the number would be. It's the onus is on that manufacturer to prove to you as the user that it conforms to that ASTM standard. Basically what he just said that UL does for the manufacturers. But people can self-declare within ASTM, and it's on them to prove that. Now, if they do that and we never, you know, we don't have a policing agency to go get somebody to do something. ASTM doesn't function that way. We will do some things. I remember there's a case where somebody put an ASTM logo on solder. Because you put the logo on there, it's going to imply that ASTM verified that, certified that solder is proper. And that wasn't the case. So the lawyers get involved, which was mentioned earlier, and that's why standards cost money. And so they get involved and ask them to cease and desist. So we'll go protect the copyright from that perspective.
Hey?
I could answer the same thing. AMI is similar to ASTM. We do not have a testing facility. We don't have conformity assessment. However, medical devices are highly regulated, so they have to go through the FDA. Now, FDA will use our standards because they're voluntary consensus standards. There are some manufacturers who will put their label saying this is AMI certified, but that doesn't mean we certified anything.
Thanks. I have a follow-up question if that's okay too.
Sure.
Or do you want to? Well, to that end, I'm wondering, I know that sometimes federal regulations take a long time to sort of come out into the open, and I imagine that at certain times your standards actually come out before the federal regulations on a certain product or process. Do you guys work in conjunction to try and make those federal regulations as safe as they need to be or as least restrictive as they can be?
Greg?
That's a tangled web question. I would say as often as we can, we'll work in parallel with the government, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, to develop consensus-based standards. The U.S. government and the Canadian government as well have a preference by legislation, I believe, to point to a consensus-based American or Canadian national document, if one exists, as opposed to writing regulation. It's generally more efficient to have someone other than the government writing something along those lines. So a lot of times you'll see the government point to, and it's a topic that we could go down a whole big discussion on, is incorporation by reference. But essentially, if that document gets pulled in by reference, the government doesn't have to write a regulation. They can just say it needs to conform with ASTM, there's a 963, I think is the toy standard. That's one of the few standards that's actually mandatory. A lot of the other standards that are out there are voluntary, but they can be made, I would say, quasi-mandatory due to the retail environment. If you go to one of the big box retailers, those consensus-based standards may be a voluntary standard, but they're not going to put the product on their shelves unless it meets the requirements. And that's where you get kind of that secondary requirement, so to speak, that these things need to conform.
I've got one more comment about the mark on the product, the safety mark in particular, be it a UL mark or a CSA mark. And both my colleagues, I'm sure, will vouch for this, and that's the word counterfeit. I've seen examples. I was at the CSA annual conference in June, and they had a table full of counterfeit products that had come in primarily from offshore, and it's the same thing with UL. I was at a National Electrical Manufacturers Association, Trade Association meeting, and a vice president of UL, whose job is counterfeiting, or not counterfeiting, but counterfeit products bearing the UL mark, talked about the raids that he's made in conjunction with the federal government into warehouses where you find products coming in from offshore that have a phony mark. He made one other comment, and I'll describe it a little bit. He used a specific store name. I'll just say his comment was, if you go to a store that sells products for $1 and they're electrical or electronic, they're probably counterfeit.
Thanks.
Monty, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll add three things. Going in reverse order, I get calls all the time from customs agents saying, we have a whole shipload of stuff with your mark on it. Can you verify that this is legitimate or not? Well, then we have to go back and try and figure out what it is, what information can you give me? What can our staff look at to try and determine what that is? But the customs agents, very much to Howard's point, they're looking all the time, what is this stuff? We can't verify what it is. We need the certifier to tell us. Going back one step before that, I found that especially the federal government, but also state agencies, they're not very nimble. I mean, except for certain cases, they can't move very quickly. So an SDO might be doing something quickly. They might be updating their codes or standards much more quickly than a state or the federal government has the ability to do so. So it's sort of dog chasing tail a little bit. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that I think you'll find across product certification, some certifiers do product testing in-house. Some will have you go to a third party and bring those results in and have the engineers look at it and certify based on that. So it can be all about which certifier you choose for your product to determine maybe what the different steps would be for certification.
Okay, thanks. Next question.
I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on proprietary specifications and standards. So things that are not created by a large organization like yourselves, but by a manufacturer or someone in industry. Because from my experience working with a mix of the standards from like ASTM and then also from specific manufacturers, not only is it cost prohibitive to work with those because there's so many that you have to use, but just calling out all the different ones and trying to get access to them can be quite difficult. So I guess kind of what are your thoughts on manufacturers creating their own standards, and are your companies doing, or groups doing anything to kind of combine everything and make it more standardized?
Comments?
No.
I'll say very briefly, before I became involved with standards, I didn't know what they were. And then very shortly after becoming involved with standards, I met someone who his job at his organization was to make proprietary standards, in-house standards for their manufacturing. And that blew my mind. I didn't even know that was something people did. The amount of time and resources they spend to create standards just for themselves. And I guess it's a cost-benefit analysis for them, and they need that to operate. But it just seems so interesting to me that this person's job and his whole, team of people from his company, that's what they work on. Standards just for them, not for anybody else, not for sale. Nobody would want them anyway because it's how widget X is made by this particular company. I thought that was very interesting. I didn't realize that was something that occurred.
Just to add to that a little bit, I think there are levels and nuances of what we classify as a standard versus an operating procedure versus a protocol. So there's a lot of vernacular and a lot of abbreviations and acronyms in this industry. You'll go blind. I think it's worse than the military, actually, from that standpoint. But if you're writing a document, there's nothing wrong with an organization writing their own operating procedures or assembly procedures. I think where there's an added benefit with what you do through an ANSI process or any consensus-based process is that rudimentary word consensus. So you're bringing together a cross-section of a bunch of different disciplines that have one common interest, one common goal, and that's to develop, in the case we're talking about, a safe product, product X. And there's oftentimes it's said that when you have a truly sound and truly good consensus-based standard, no one walks out of the room happy, but they walk out of the room with something they can live with. So all that collective input brings something, so you get rid of those individual biases that may be around intellectual property ties or giving someone a competitive advantage, because let's face it, every time someone comes to the table, they're bringing their own agenda. So that process tries to minimize that nothing gets control over that, either from a balance or a bias standpoint.
At the same time, in an open market society, such as the one we have in North America, any company can come up with their own product as long as it meets whatever safety requirements or federal requirements may be involved. It could be a protocol. I happen to be involved in the lighting industry, and there's one major lighting company that has its own communication protocol, and they've been very successful with it, but nobody else can use it because they've got it patented. But they're free to do that if they wish, but other people can't use it. So I'm also involved in some ANSI work now where we're trying to develop some open protocols. So we'll see how that plays out.
Just with your frustration that if you come across a standard that you think is cumbersome or isn't very effective, you could probably join any one of these organizations and affect change. That's the beauty of an ASTM, and I've heard it repetitively with other folks here. Anybody can join. And that's what happens, and that'll bring somebody into the room. They might think they have the best standard written, but you come up and you bring your perspective. They'll listen to it, and they might reluctantly agree, or they might not be too happy and they leave mad, but you can affect the change to that standard. And that's what every student and every person sitting in here could do, that regardless what organization they wanted to join.
Thank you.
So we learned a lot today about the different standards bodies, and obviously there are more than was represented on the panel today. So how much overlap do you see between individual standards bodies? A lot of the standards are based on performance or safety. So are there instances of overlap for the same type of product, same type of performance? And when there is overlap between different organizations, how do you get to some consensus between ISO and some other organization?
That's right.
I just made a comment to my colleagues. I'm sitting in the perfect seat between the two of them right now. They are expanding their spheres of influence. One is going south, one is going north. And it's an interesting question, and I don't know how things like that get resolved. Maybe the market will end up resolving it.
Well, I can tell you. Let me answer that question, if I may. This is where ANSI comes in. If we're going to, if we're thinking about writing a standard on widgets, and we want it to be ANSI approved, we'll send a note to ANSI and say, hey, we're getting ready to work on this. And ANSI will publish it for all to see. And if CSA says, hey, we already got a standard for widgets, and we'll say, oh, yes, you do. Okay, we're going to back off on that. And it's a give and take between the standards development organizations. Where there's gaps, then we fill them. If there's overlap, nobody wants to do the work twice.
Yeah, I think there's actually times too, and believe it or not, we will collaborate on topics too. Do joint ventures. Sometimes there's the trifecta, if you will. You may have 3 organizations that are drafting standards. But it's a great point. I mean, there's a mechanism that exists within ANSI to vet that. It'll usually come down to a discussion between the organizations that want to draft the document. There's a PINS process, a project identification notification, I can't remember what the S stands for, system, which essentially is that submission that we were talking about, where you send that in there and say, hey, I have an intent to write this. I've got people that have an interest. And that's the opportunity for anyone that is either down the path already or starting to come to the table and say, hey, we'd like to do that too, or we already have it.
It's my understanding, and speaking now more for IATMO than for ANSI, ANSI, they don't want to referee. They don't want to choose your standard was first, you're right, your standard second, so that's wrong. It does want to force the parties to communicate. And if they can resolve it, great. If they can't resolve it, and the second standard in all other ways meets the designation for an American national standard such that it can be granted that status, I think it'll probably get that status simply because it's not about choosing. It's about the parties working together either to find a resolution or in some cases to not find one.
And I could add to it, internationally, at least between the IEC and the ISO groups, sometimes we form joint working groups. So for example, IEC deals with all the electrotechnical equipment, and ISO deals with all the other things out there. But we have several joint working groups where they come to and one, either from IEC or ISO, will take the lead on the project, but they'll invite the members from the other side to come to all the meetings and participate. And so that's how it gets resolved. We have within AMI, so we're medical, but UL has an interoperability section, and we have an interoperability section just for the medical devices. So we have an MOU between the 2 organizations, and they have a group that work on the standards together.
Okay, Janet, we got time for more questions? Are we breaking? Or any more questions?
Hi, I have a question on what you do when standards seem to be inhibiting unity instead of helping it. So in my mind, I'm thinking of IEEE 1394 versus USB. That sort of divided the industry for a while instead of unified it. So I was wondering how you deal with that, and then also how you let a standard die, like IEEE 1394.
Howard?
When you develop a standard, there's a line you have to walk, of course, or you try to walk, between inhibiting creativity and allowing creativity. Sometimes you hit it, sometimes you're on one side or the other side. If things have changed as time passes, then it's time to revise the standard to make it more amenable to fostering creativity. If you have some particular thoughts on the standard, I would strongly encourage you to get in touch with one of the folks that I mentioned at IEEE staff. Bring your thoughts to their attention and ask them to put you in touch with the right people who are involved in the particular standard and see if you can get it changed.
Greg?
Just a quick addition to that. There's, once again, part of the ANSI process, there's a public review for all of these documents. It's a part of the process that's incorporated. So that's where anyone in the universe could potentially voice in and raise an issue, and that document goes out for public review. Every standard that's an American national standard, and a Canadian for that matter, there's a set 5-year maximum time frame that standard will be refreshed. Some of them are refreshed a lot sooner than that. So when that window of opportunity comes up, raise your hand, submit something to either the TAG or the Standards Development Committee that's in charge of that product, whichever SDO it happens to be residing with, and your voice can be heard.
I want to thank you for that opportunity. ASTM standards don't go out to public review. Some of ASTM standards are American national standards, but most of the standards that are written by ASTM are reviewed by the 30,000 members of ASTM that look at it and review it. So they'd be limiting for that, so you would have to join, but anybody could join. And we actually have a standards tracking service that you can sign up to a particular industry, and when a revision is happening to a particular standard, you as a non-member can review that and reach out to ASTM and try to affect change. We also have the same 5-year review policy, but within ASTM, what's really nice about it, it can be revised at any time. You know, and I would say there's something, when I was in the Army a long time ago, we always said something about fresh eyes or tired eyes. It was tired eyes. Because you'll get somebody, these guys, ASTM, and it might be true for some of the other organizations, we actually have members that have been ASTM members for 50 years or more. And I mean, you look at anything for 50 years, and even I start to look better. But, I'm sorry. But no, if you look at anything for 50 years, it's just, you know, you might miss something. I've had situations in ASTM standards where there may have been a particular section that had a formula wrong, and it may have been in print for 10 years. I mean, seriously, because people look at it and they use that, because we use that standard every day. We go into that lab, I know how to do this, and they don't read it. And your boss showed you how to use it as a new tech coming into the lab, and it just goes that way and nobody looks at it. But then we'll get somebody with fresh eyes and review that, and they'll come in, and that's part of the beauty of ASTM. Everybody has an equal voice. And you bring in that discrepancy or whatever the problem is, and we'll look at it and we'll say, man, actually the guys have been here for 50 years will be embarrassed that it's been here that long. But then we'll get it fixed.
Yeah, and I guess I'd like to add, if you're a company that has a vested interest in one of these standards, you better send a committee member to that committee and work on that standard, or you may be shut out. So you want to have your opinions heard as well.
Assume that an entrepreneur created a device and it got UL certification, it got CSA certification, and somebody purchased that item and it failed. So who is responsible in this situation? Was there any occasion or any instances that a certified device failed, fired, or led to something unusual?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
No, just kidding. Yeah, that can happen. And that's where CPSC gets involved. But also, who knows what it could have been? Maybe there's a manufacturing process that was off. It's hard. You can't say that the product failed because it didn't comply with the standard. That's a tough statement to make. There's so many things that can go haywire along the lines. But it does happen, yeah. A product that has a listing mark fails in the field. And we have folks that investigate those things.
I'm in the middle between my two colleagues. But what I have been taught by them is that a product that bears the mark, basically that says at the time the product left the factory, it complied with the safety standard, period.
I'll add a little nuance to that. The certification, you're certifying a model of something. It's important to understand that certification is not quality control. So UL, CSA, we're not in your factories 24/7 running your production lines to make sure everything that's coming off that line is Johnny spot on. Our job is to make sure that what you tell us you're going to make and the components that you're using in that are indeed what you're doing. And we have an audit program and a surveillance program that does that. And when we do have a failure in the field, much the same as UL, we have a whole group that goes out and audits and investigates those situations if need be to look into that.
Yeah, I would adopt those comments 100%, what you all said. And you know, the fact of the matter is products fail all the time for a variety of reasons. And the manufacturers are strictly liable because the manufacturer bears the gain from selling the product. The certifier does not bear any such gain. The certifier takes their fee for doing their work and therefore is not considered to be liable for the product failure, unless, of course, you go to court and prove your case and say this certifier failed to do their job for X, Y, and Z reasons.
One other thing, and again, sitting between my two friends, I think we're still friends. UL and CSA are concerned basically about three things: sharp edges, fire safety, and shock hazard. Not performance. If it fails a day after it leaves the factory on a performance issue, that's not a safety issue. That's a manufacturer issue. Manufacturers have warranties. Sometimes they're very short, 30 days, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Then you got to read the fine print in the warranty to see if it's really useful. But performance is different than safety.
Okay. All right, I think we're due for a break now, and we're coming back at what time? 5:30 for the next panel. Can we give a round of applause to our first panel?